The true story of the Lennox sisters.
Caroline is clever.
Independence of thought is not wicked.
Most people think it is.
Most people do not think.
Emily is a mother to me.
Infidelity in men is as common as rain, and has as little meaning.
Louisa is an angel.
Will you be dissatisfied when we all love you?
What are you?
I think I am a disappointment.
Aristocrats, new drama coming in June to BBC One.
Underdog Zimbabwe are suddenly looking good for a semi-final place. Australia cannot afford to lose at this stage. Live World Cup cricket, Zimbabwe versus Australia, Wednesday on BBC Television and Radio at 10:30 and throughout the day.
Milosevic backs down over Kosovo. But can he be trusted to keep his word? Will 1 million refugees now feel safe to go home? Kosovo, The Reckoning, a panorama special with David Dimbleby, tomorrow at 10:05 on BBC One.
Returning to South Africa to catch up with the stories of black and white teenagers last filmed 7 years ago. 14 Up is in 15 minutes here on BBC One. First on BBC One, the BBC News with Peter Sissons.
Serb generals are tonight resisting NATO's terms for pulling out of Kosovo. With talks close to collapse, NATO warns it's now make or break. Over Kosovo, alliance bombers turn up the pressure on the Yugoslav army. And Agassi joins the tennis greats, winner at last of all 4 Grand Slams. Good evening. 3 days ago, Slobodan Milosevic agreed to it, but didn't sign it. Tonight, his generals won't agree to it and won't sign it. And the agreement that was meant to pave the way for the Yugoslav army's retreat from Kosovo remains stalled and possibly close to collapse after 2 days of talks at an airbase in Macedonia. A NATO spokesman said there were major problems, not just technical. The Belgrade generals were not signing up to the principles. From the base at Kumanovo, Ben Brown.
3 Serb generals and their advisors came into the Lion's Den for today's talks, a NATO airbase bristling with sophisticated weaponry. At first, hopes were high the agreement would be signed, but then it became clear that the Yugoslav general Svetoslav Marjanovic and his fellow delegates were in no mood to do what NATO wanted and withdraw their forces from Kosovo within 7 days. The British general, Sir Mike Jackson, looked cheerful enough, but as the day wore on, he began to lose patience with the Serbs. Tempers rose in the tented hangar where the talks are taking place. Tempers became frayed, and fans had to be brought in to cool the increasingly heated atmosphere. As the light faded, so did the prospects for peace. NATO had assumed the Serbs would rubber stamp this document on their withdrawal. In fact, they've objected to almost everything in it, stubbornly stonewalling, according to NATO sources. Tonight, the Serbs were given a break from the talks so they could consult with their leaders in Belgrade.
Giving them time to go back to their command structure. As you know, as I've already said, about a week ago, there was an agreement by the Parliament to accept the principles, and at the moment, they are not signing to those principles.
NATO sources say they are prepared to give this meeting a few more hours, but they're unwilling to let it slip into a 3rd day tomorrow. They're pessimistic. It looks like the talks are not only stalled, they're on the brink of collapse. For the refugees in camps not far from here, it means more delay in getting back to their homes. These people are becoming increasingly agitated and impatient. Like NATO, the refugees had thought the Serbs would be leaving Kosovo in the coming week. Now they're not so sure. Ben Brown, BBC News, Macedonia.
And our defence correspondent Mark Leahy joins me now from NATO headquarters in Brussels. Mark, are you getting any information in Brussels about what the big problem is that's holding up these talks?
Yes, I mean, as Ben has just said, they're objecting to virtually everything, which is part of the standard stonewalling tactics, playing for time, seeking out weaknesses. But there's one or two which are standing out. And I think the most difficult one is that part of this 6-page document recognises NATO's right to be the peace implementation force, and that's one of the things they're objecting to strongly, saying that they don't have the right to sign it. Now that would mean in effect they don't recognise NATO's presence there, although they could do nothing to stop it. And I think that is one of the key issues amongst the others. But part of it is this seeking for weaknesses, this standard Balkan tactic of agree one day, stonewall the next, and see what the other side do, and hope that they blink.
And would NATO be prepared to walk away from it all?
I think that there are signs that they will be prepared to walk away from it, because they recognise that if they start negotiating, which they said they wouldn't, these talks would go on forever and the Serbs will keep coming up with other things. What it does mean is they've got to be prepared to go back to heavy bombing. They've been downgrading the bombing. People have been very pleased at that. Some of the nations who are more dovish have looked at that, would object to it going up. But I think increasingly there's a sense that unless you're prepared to intensify the bombing, take it back into Bosnia, into Serbia and so on, then you might end up with big problems because it will be seen as weak, and President Milosevic battens on to weakness very, very quickly indeed.
Mark Leahy in Brussels, thank you. And the BBC's World Affairs editor, John Simpson, is in Belgrade. John, is what's happening in Kumanovo entirely predictable?
I'm afraid it is entirely predictable, yes. I think anybody who's dealt with the Serbian army, particularly in this kind of way, can expect them to just nitpick about every single fine detail. And over and above that, President Milosevic may very well be wanting to show that this is a negotiation after all. It's not just a capitulation on his part. So everything he does seems to be done first with an eye to his own public opinion, as in showing it's not a capitulation. Secondly, to divide his enemies. For what it's worth, we're hearing here that the problem is the 25-kilometer zone of withdrawal into Serbia, but that really is, I think, more likely to be the excuse for the delay rather than a serious cause of it.
Briefly, John, if the talks stall and the bombing is stepped up, how would you expect the public in Belgrade to react?
Well, pretty angrily, I think, and I think the anger would be turned more against President Milosevic than against NATO. No one's been overjoyed here, I suppose, by the idea that their country has given in, but it is amazing what a few nights free of bombing can do to morale. I think President Milosevic would get all the blame if the bombing starts again, and I just can't believe he wants that at this very delicate time in his own personal standing.
John Simpson in Belgrade, thank you. Despite the talks, fighting continued on the Albanian border. American B-52 bombers attacked Serb positions just inside Kosovo, and the Serbs shelled positions held by the Kosovo Liberation Army.
As NATO commanders were talking, their bombers were attacking Serb positions. People from villages just inside Albania moved out after their homes were shelled by the Serbs. Civilians and refugees from Kosovo who stayed spent the weekend in their shelters. In between the shells and the bombs, more Kosovo Albanians have been deported by the Serbs. These men were released from prison, then pushed out over the border. Most of them said they were beaten by the Serbs. Recep Kuci said he was kicked and punched for 3 hours. Then the Serb police called in 15 or so children who were playing outside. They gave the children iron bars, then they beat the prisoners. Back at the border, artillery exchanges between the Kosovo Liberation Army and the Serbs followed the NATO airstrikes.
NATO is sending some very strong messages here, to the Serbs, of course, but also to the Kosovo refugees who still don't quite believe that Slobodan